The courthouse was busy that Tuesday morning. People rushed through the hallways, lawyers carried thick folders, and the smell of coffee mixed with old wood filled the air. Judge Patricia Morgan sat in her chambers, flipping through the day's case files. She'd been a judge for almost 20 years now, and honestly, most days felt exactly the same. She took a sip of her coffee and sighed. Another landlord-tenant dispute, another small claims case, another day of people arguing over a few $1,000s. Patricia had seen it all before. She straightened her black robe, checked her reflection one last time, and walked into the courtroom. The bailiff called everyone to order, and the morning session began. Patricia handled 3 cases quickly: a fender bender, a broken lease, a dispute over a damaged security deposit. By the 4th case, she was already thinking about lunch. Next case, the bailiff announced: Henderson versus the estate of Dorothy Chen, case number 2847. A middle-aged man in an expensive suit walked confidently to the plaintiff's table. His shoes clicked against the wooden floor. Everything about him screamed success and money. Patricia nodded at him. She recognized the type: professional landlord. Probably owned a dozen properties around the city. Then she looked at the defendant's table. A teenage boy stood there alone. He couldn't have been more than 17 or 18 years old. He wore a gray hoodie with the strings pulled tight, faded jeans with a small tear at the knee, and beat-up sneakers that had seen better days. His backpack looked like something a high school kid would carry to class. His hair stuck up in different directions like he'd just rolled out of bed. Patricia felt her jaw tighten. This was exactly what frustrated her about young people today. No respect, no understanding of how serious the legal system was. The boy didn't even have the decency to dress properly for court. The plaintiff's lawyer stood up. His name was Richard Hayes, and Patricia had seen him in her courtroom dozens of times. He always won his cases because people rarely bothered to fight back properly. Your Honor, Hayes began smoothly. This is a straightforward matter. My client owns the property at 4892 Riverside Avenue. The defendant's grandmother, Dorothy Chen, resided there and failed to pay rent for 3 consecutive months. Despite multiple notices and opportunities to remedy the situation, no payment was received. We're seeking the full amount owed, plus late fees and legal costs. The total comes to $7,800. Hayes slid a stack of papers across to the bailiff, who brought them to Patricia's bench. Everything looked official: rental agreement, payment history, notices of late payment, a final demand letter. Patricia looked down at the teenager. He stood there with his hands in his hoodie pocket looking at the floor. She felt her irritation growing. Where is the defendant? Patricia asked. Where is Dorothy Chen? The boy finally looked up. She's my grandmother, Your Honor. She's in the hospital. She's really sick and couldn't come today. I'm here to represent her. Patricia almost laughed. Represent her, this kid? Young man, Patricia said, her voice sharp. This is a court of law. This isn't some game you play on your phone. This isn't YouTube or TikTok where you can just show up and wing it. Where is your attorney? The boy shifted his weight. I don't need an attorney, Your Honor. I can handle this case myself. Now Patricia did let out a harsh laugh. Several people in the courtroom gallery turned to look. Hayes smirked at the plaintiff's table. You can handle this yourself, Patricia repeated. Do you have any idea how the legal system works? Have you ever even been inside a courtroom before today? Yes, Your Honor, I have, the boy said quietly. Patricia ignored him. She was on a roll now. 20 years of dealing with people who didn't take her courtroom seriously came pouring out. Let me tell you something, Patricia continued, her voice rising slightly. I've been doing this job for 2 decades. I've seen thousands of cases. And you know what I'm tired of? I'm tired of young people like you who think you can just walk in here in your pajamas and waste everyone's time. This is serious business. Real money. Real consequences. Your grandmother's about to lose a judgment for almost $8,000 because you thought you could play lawyer for a day. The boy didn't respond. He just stood there, calm as anything, his expression completely neutral. That annoyed Patricia even more. She wanted him to understand how foolish he was being. Look at you, Patricia said. You can't even be bothered to dress appropriately. Do you know what proper courtroom attire is? Do you have any legal training whatsoever? Have you read a single law book in your entire life? Hayes was practically glowing at his table. This was going exactly how he wanted. An easy win against some kid who didn't know what he was doing. The boy took a slow breath. Your Honor, if I could just... No, Patricia cut him off. You've already wasted enough of this court's time. Mr. Hayes, present your evidence. Hayes stood up again, still smirking. He went through his case piece by piece. The rental agreement showed Dorothy Chen had agreed to pay $1,200 per month. The payment records showed she'd paid regularly for 2 years, then suddenly stopped. 3 months of missed payments. 3 certified letters sent to the address. No response to any of them. As you can see, Your Honor, Hayes concluded, this is an open and shut case. The defendant has no defense. She simply stopped paying rent. Patricia nodded. She'd seen hundreds of cases exactly like this one. She looked at the teenager again. He still stood there quietly, that same calm look on his face. It was almost unnerving how composed he seemed. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Patricia asked him. Any reason at all why I shouldn't rule in favor of the plaintiff right now? The boy finally smiled. It wasn't a nervous smile or an apologetic one. It was confident, almost knowing. Actually, Your Honor, he said, reaching for his backpack, I have quite a bit to say. But first, I need to submit something to the court. He pulled out a leather folder from his backpack, not a school folder. Something professional. He handed it to the bailiff, who brought it to Patricia's bench. Patricia opened it, expecting to see some amateur attempt at a legal document. What she saw instead made her blood run cold. It was a bar card, an active license to practice law in the state, and the photo on it matched the teenage boy standing in front of her. Patricia stared at the bar card in her hands. She read it once, then twice, then a third time, hoping the words would somehow change. But they didn't. The name read, Daniel Chen, attorney at law, licensed to practice in the state. Bar number 847592, issue date 2 years ago. Status, active and in good standing. She looked up at the teenager. No, not a teenager. An attorney. A licensed attorney who she had just spent the last 5 minutes insulting and belittling in front of a courtroom full of people. Patricia's face felt hot. Her mouth went dry. In 20 years on the bench, she had never felt this embarrassed. Is this real? She heard herself ask, though she already knew the answer. Daniel nodded calmly. Yes, Your Honor. Would you like me to provide additional verification? The courtroom had gone completely silent. You could hear people breathing. Someone's phone buzzed, and it sounded like a fire alarm in the quiet. Hayes, the plaintiff's attorney, had stopped smirking. He leaned forward at his table, squinting at Daniel like he was seeing him for the first time. Patricia handed the bar card to her clerk. Verify this now. The clerk took the card and walked quickly to his computer. Everyone waited. Patricia could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. 30 seconds passed. Then a minute. Finally, the clerk looked up and nodded. It's legitimate, Your Honor. He's a fully licensed attorney. Passed the bar at 19 years old. No disciplinary actions on his record. A murmur spread through the courtroom. People leaned forward in their seats. A few pulled out their phones to look up whether this was even possible. Patricia set down her gavel carefully, like she was afraid it might explode. She cleared her throat. Mr. Chen, I apologize for my earlier comments. They were inappropriate regardless of your credentials. Daniel gave a small nod. Thank you, Your Honor. I understand how it must have looked. I came straight from the hospital where I was visiting my grandmother. I didn't have time to change. Patricia felt another wave of shame wash over her. The hospital, of course. She'd been so quick to judge, so certain she knew everything about this young man from his appearance. Would you like to proceed with the case? Patricia asked, her voice much softer now. Yes, Your Honor. If the court permits, I'd like to present my defense. Patricia gestured for him to continue. She felt like she was watching her entire morning get rewritten in real time. Daniel reached into his backpack again. This time he pulled out a thick folder, neatly organized with colored tabs. He approached the bench and handed copies to both the judge and Hayes. Your Honor, the plaintiff's case appears straightforward on the surface, but there's a lot more to this story. My grandmother didn't stop paying rent because she wanted to. She stopped because the apartment became legally uninhabitable. Hayes jumped up. Objection, Your Honor, there's no evidence of any— I have extensive evidence, Daniel interrupted smoothly. If counsel would let me finish, Patricia nodded. Continue, Mr. Chen. Daniel opened his folder. 3 months before my grandmother stopped paying rent, a pipe burst in the ceiling of her apartment. She reported it immediately to the landlord. Here's the email, time-stamped and with a read receipt. The landlord promised to fix it but never did. He pulled out printed emails and handed them to the bailiff. Patricia read through them. Sure enough, there was Dorothy Chen's polite message explaining the leak, and there was the landlord's response promising to send someone next week. That was 6 months ago, Daniel continued. The leak was never properly fixed. Instead, it got worse. Water damaged the ceiling, then mold started growing. Not just a little mold, toxic black mold. He pulled out photographs. Patricia felt her stomach turn as she looked at them. The pictures showed a bedroom ceiling covered in dark, spreading patches of mold. Water stains ran down the walls. In some shots, you could see the ceiling sagging from water damage. My grandmother is 72 years old, Daniel said, his voice steady but with an edge now. She has asthma. The mold made her sick. Really sick. She ended up in the hospital twice. Here are her medical records with permission to share them with the court. More papers. Patricia read the doctor's notes. Respiratory distress. Mold exposure. Recommendation to leave the premises immediately. Hayes was frantically flipping through his own copy of the documents. He hadn't known about any of this. Under State Housing Code, Section 247(3), Daniel continued, a tenant has the legal right to withhold rent when a landlord fails to maintain habitable conditions. My grandmother exercised that right. She notified the landlord in writing that she was withholding rent until repairs were completed. He produced another letter, sent certified mail with a signature confirmation. The landlord received this letter, Daniel said, and instead of fixing the apartment, he chose to sue my grandmother for the money. Patricia looked at Hayes. Counselor, were you aware of any of this? Hayes shuffled his papers. Your Honor, my client informed me that the tenant simply stopped paying. He said nothing about habitability issues. Of course he didn't, Daniel said, because if he had, you would have advised him that this case was unwinnable. Patricia had to suppress a smile. This young attorney had just politely called out both the landlord and his lawyer. There's more, Your Honor, Daniel continued. Not only did the landlord fail to make repairs, but he also harassed my grandmother. Phone calls at all hours, threats of immediate eviction without proper notice. I have recordings of these calls, made with my grandmother's knowledge and consent in accordance with state law. He pulled out a small digital recorder and a transcript of the calls. Patricia listened to 30 seconds of one recording and had to stop. The landlord's voice was aggressive, threatening, completely inappropriate. So let me summarize, Daniel said, walking back to his table. My client withheld rent legally due to uninhabitable conditions. The landlord refused to make necessary repairs. Instead, he harassed an elderly woman with health problems and then filed this lawsuit hoping she wouldn't fight back. He turned to face Hayes directly. But she didn't face this alone, because I'm her grandson, and I became a lawyer specifically to fight cases like this. The courtroom was electric. Patricia saw people in the gallery pulling out notepads. A few lawyers who were waiting for their own cases looked impressed. Hayes stood up slowly. Your Honor, could we have a brief recess? I need to consult with my client. Patricia nodded. 15 minutes. As the courtroom emptied for the break, Patricia sat alone at her bench staring at the evidence spread before her. She'd been so wrong, so completely, utterly wrong, and something told her this case was far from over. The 15-minute recess felt like an hour. Patricia sat in her chambers, drinking water and replaying the morning in her head. Every harsh word she'd said to Daniel echoed in her mind. Every assumption she'd made based on his appearance. She'd violated the very principle she'd sworn to uphold, treating everyone in her courtroom with equal dignity. Through her chamber window, she could see the hallway outside. Daniel stood there on his phone, probably talking to his grandmother. Hayes was in the corner with his client, the landlord. The landlord was a heavy-set man in his 50s, gesturing wildly with his hands. Even from a distance, Patricia could tell he was angry. Hayes looked stressed. He kept shaking his head, running his hand through his hair. This was clearly not how he'd expected his morning to go. When everyone filed back into the courtroom, the energy had completely changed. The gallery was more crowded now. Word had spread through the courthouse about the teenage lawyer who'd turned a simple case upside down. Several veteran attorneys had slipped in to watch the rest of the proceedings. All rise, the bailiff announced, and Patricia returned to her bench. Mr. Hayes, Patricia said, are you ready to continue? Hayes stood up. He looked like a man who'd aged 5 years during the recess. Your Honor, after consulting with my client, we'd like to address some of the issues raised by opposing counsel. I'm sure you would, Daniel said quietly from his table. Patricia shot him a look, but she couldn't quite hide the hint of amusement in her eyes. "Mr. Chen, please." "Apologies, Your Honor." Hayes cleared his throat. "My client maintains that he was unaware of the full extent of the mold problem. He sent a maintenance worker to address the initial leak, and he believed the matter was resolved." Daniel stood up. "Your Honor, may I respond?" Patricia nodded. Daniel pulled out yet another document from his seemingly endless folder. "I have signed statements from 2 other tenants in the same building. Both reported similar leak and mold problems. Both were ignored. One tenant actually broke her lease early and moved out because the landlord refused to address the issues. This isn't ignorance. It's a pattern." He handed the statements to the bailiff. Patricia read them carefully. The stories were nearly identical to his grandmother's situation. Different apartments, same building, same neglect. Hayes looked at his client, who stared down at the table and said nothing. "Furthermore," Daniel continued, "I'd like to present evidence of the harassment my grandmother endured. Your Honor already heard a sample of the recorded calls. But there's more. Text messages threatening immediate eviction. Messages sent at 2 in the morning. 3 in the morning. Constant intimidation designed to scare an elderly woman into paying rent for an apartment that was literally making her sick." He projected the text messages on the courtroom screen. Patricia read them and her expression hardened. The messages were cruel, threatening, completely out of line. "My grandmother has lived in that apartment for 12 years, Daniel said, his voice carrying more emotion now. 12 years of paying rent on time. Never a single problem. And the moment she exercises her legal right to withhold rent due to uninhabitable conditions, she gets treated like a criminal." The courtroom was silent except for Daniel's voice. "But here's what really bothers me, Your Honor. The plaintiff's attorney filed this case knowing my grandmother probably wouldn't have the resources to fight back. They counted on her being scared. They counted on her being alone. They filed for almost $8,000, hoping to get a default judgment because she couldn't afford a lawyer." Hayes shifted uncomfortably. "Your Honor, that's not—" "It's exactly what happened," Daniel interrupted. "And it happens every day in courtrooms across this country. Landlords with expensive lawyers going after tenants who can't defend themselves. Well, my grandmother isn't alone, and I'm not just here to defend against this lawsuit." Patricia leaned forward. "What do you mean, Mr. Chen?" Daniel pulled out one more set of documents. "I'm filing a counterclaim for damages, emotional distress, medical expenses related to mold exposure, and punitive damages for harassment and violation of tenant rights. I'm also reporting the property to the City Housing Authority for code violations." He walked forward and handed the counterclaim to the bailiff. Patricia took it and started reading. The counterclaim was thorough, professional, and absolutely devastating. Daniel was seeking $15,000 in damages. Hayes shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. We came here for a simple rent collection case, and now you're facing the consequences of your client's actions," Patricia said firmly. She was done letting this slide. "Mr. Hayes, your client operated rental properties with serious code violations. He harassed a tenant. He filed a baseless lawsuit. Mr. Chen's counterclaim appears to have merit." The landlord leaned over and whispered urgently to Hayes. Hayes listened, then whispered back. The landlord's face turned red. More urgent whispering. Finally, Hayes stood up. "Your Honor, could we have another brief recess? My client would like to discuss a possible settlement." Patricia almost said no. She wanted to hear Daniel argue the full case. The young attorney had clearly prepared extensively, and part of her wanted to see him in full action. But settlements were often better for everyone involved. 10 minutes, Patricia said. This time the recess was pure chaos. The landlord and Hayes argued in heated whispers in the hallway. Daniel made another phone call, presumably updating his grandmother. The lawyers in the gallery talked among themselves, clearly impressed by what they'd witnessed. Patricia overheard 2 of them talking near her chamber door. "That's Daniel Chen," one said. "I've heard about him. Youngest person to pass the bar in 10 years. Graduated law school at 21. Turned down offers from every major firm in the city." "Why would he turn those down?" the other asked. "Because he wanted to help people like his grandmother. He runs a small practice out of a shared office space. Takes cases that big firms won't touch. Tenant rights, mostly. Works for almost nothing." Patricia felt her respect for the young attorney grow even more. He wasn't just smart. He was principled, When everyone returned, Hayes looked defeated. The landlord looked angry but resigned. "Your Honor," Hayes began, "my client would like to propose a settlement. He's willing to forgive all claimed rent. He'll pay for Mrs. Chen's medical expenses related to the mold exposure. He'll cover her moving costs to a new apartment, and he'll pay $5,000 in additional damages." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He pulled out his phone and typed something. Waiting for his grandmother's response, Patricia realized. After a minute, Daniel looked up. "My grandmother agrees to the settlement on one additional condition. The landlord must hire a licensed inspector to check every unit in the building and fix any mold or water damage found. Proof of completion must be submitted to the housing authority within 60 days. The landlord whispered to Hayes, who nodded. "Agreed," Hayes said. Patricia took a breath. "The court accepts the settlement terms. I'll have the agreement drawn up for signatures," and just like that it was over. Daniel had walked into the courtroom alone, been insulted and dismissed, and walked out having won everything for his grandmother, and probably helped every other tenant in that building too. As people started filing out, Patricia knew she had one more thing she needed to do. The courtroom cleared out slowly. People lingered, still talking about what they'd just witnessed. Hayes packed up his briefcase quickly, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The landlord stormed out without a word, his face still red with anger and embarrassment. Daniel gathered his papers methodically, organizing everything back into his folder with the same careful attention he'd shown throughout the case. Patricia watched him from the bench, trying to find the right words for what she needed to say. "Mr. Chen," she finally called out, "could you stay for a moment, please?" Daniel looked up, slightly surprised. "Of course, Your Honor." The bailiff and court reporter exchanged glances but said nothing as they left. Within a minute, it was just Patricia and Daniel in the empty courtroom. The silence felt heavy, like the room itself was holding its breath. Patricia removed her glasses and set them on the bench. It was a gesture she rarely made, like removing part of her armor. She wasn't speaking as a judge now, but as one human being to another. "I owe you an apology," Patricia said. "A real one, not just the quick one I gave earlier in front of everyone." Daniel started to speak, but she held up her hand. "Please, let me finish. I've been sitting up here for 20 years, and I've always told myself that I treat everyone fairly, that I don't judge people. But today I did exactly that. I judged you the moment you walked through that door." Her voice cracked slightly and she paused to steady herself. "I saw your clothes, your age, and I made assumptions, terrible assumptions. I insulted you. I talked down to you. I questioned your intelligence and your seriousness. And I did all of that without knowing a single thing about who you actually are." Daniel stood quietly, listening. His expression was hard to read. "The worst part," Patricia continued, "is that I did it from a position of power. You couldn't fight back. You couldn't tell me I was wrong without looking disrespectful. You had to stand there and take it because I have this robe and this gavel and this bench." She looked down at her hands. "That's not justice. That's the opposite of justice. And I'm ashamed of myself." The courtroom was so quiet that Patricia could hear the old clock on the wall ticking. Daniel shifted his weight, his sneakers squeaking softly on the polished floor. "Your Honor," Daniel said finally, his voice gentle, "I appreciate your apology. I really do. And I accept it. But," Patricia asked, sensing there was more. Daniel smiled, but it was a sad smile. "But I need you to understand something. This wasn't the first time someone judged me like that, and it won't be the last." He walked a few steps closer to the bench. "I've been going to court since I was 20 years old, and every single time someone makes an assumption, bailiffs think I'm there for a traffic ticket. Court clerks ask me if I'm lost. Other lawyers don't take me seriously until I start talking. And judges," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Some judges have been great. They treat me like any other attorney. But others, they see my face and immediately think I don't belong. That I'm too young, too inexperienced, that I should go back to school or get a real job." Patricia felt each word like a punch to the gut. "I knew what was going to happen when I walked in here today," Daniel continued. "I knew how it would look. I could have worn a suit. I could have made it easier on myself. But my grandmother was alone in a hospital bed, scared and in pain. And honestly, I shouldn't have to wear a costume to be treated with basic respect." "You're absolutely right," Patricia said quietly. "The thing is, Daniel said. I've developed thick skin. I can handle it. But what about everyone else? What about the people who walk into courtrooms every day who don't have law degrees? The single mothers who can't afford childcare and show up in their work uniforms? The laborers who come straight from construction sites? The teenagers who are genuinely lost and scared? He wasn't angry. His voice remained calm, almost conversational. But every word hit home. If those people get treated the way you treated me this morning, they don't have a bar card to pull out and change your mind. They just lose. They lose their cases, their money, maybe their homes, because someone decided based on their appearance that they weren't worth listening to. Patricia nodded slowly. You're right. You're completely right. I'm not telling you this to make you feel worse, Daniel said. I'm telling you because you seem like someone who actually cares. Some people would have doubled down, tried to save face, but you apologized. That matters. It's not enough, though, Patricia said. An apology isn't enough. No, Daniel agreed. But it's a start. They stood in silence for a moment. Outside, the courthouse buzzed with activity. But in this courtroom, time seemed to have stopped. Can I ask you something? Patricia said. Why did you become a lawyer, really? Daniel smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. Because of my grandmother. She raised me after my parents died. She worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat, and I watched landlords take advantage of her. Bosses who underpaid her. Companies that refused to give her benefits. The system wasn't built for people like her. He adjusted his backpack on his shoulder. When I was 15, we almost got evicted. The landlord claimed we owed money we didn't owe. My grandmother couldn't afford a lawyer. We went to court and the judge barely listened to her. She tried to explain, but the judge just kept cutting her off. We lost. We had to borrow money from my grandmother's church just to pay what the judge ordered. Patricia's chest tightened. I decided that day that I would become a lawyer, that I would fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves, people that the system overlooks or tramples on. So I studied. I worked harder than I've ever worked at anything. And I got here. Your grandmother must be incredibly proud of you, Patricia said. She is, Daniel said, though she still worries that I don't eat enough and work too much. They both laughed, and the tension in the room finally broke. Can I ask you for something? Patricia said. I mentor a group of young law students. They meet once a month to discuss the profession, ethics, challenges. Would you be willing to come speak to them? Share your experiences? Daniel considered it. What would you want me to talk about? The truth, Patricia said. About what it's like to enter this profession as a young person. About fighting for people who need help. About dealing with people's assumptions and prejudices. About staying true to your principles when it would be easier to compromise. Daniel thought for a moment, then nodded. Okay, I'll do it. Thank you, Patricia said. And Daniel? If I may call you that? Of course. Don't let the world make you cynical. Don't let experiences like this morning make you hard. The legal system needs more people like you. People who remember why justice matters. Daniel picked up his backpack and headed toward the door. Before leaving, he turned back. Your Honor, the fact that you're willing to learn, to change, to admit when you're wrong, that's pretty rare. Hold on to that. And with that, he was gone, leaving Patricia alone with her thoughts and a renewed sense of what her job really meant. 3 weeks later, Patricia sat in a conference room at the courthouse with 12 law students gathered around a long table. They were in their 20s and 30s, full of energy and idealism. Some wore professional suits. Others looked more casual. Patricia noticed she didn't immediately judge any of them by their appearance. That was progress. Our guest speaker should be here any minute, Patricia told the group. He's a young attorney with an interesting story. I think you'll find what he has to say valuable. The door opened and Daniel walked in. He wore the same gray hoodie from that day in court. Patricia smiled. She'd specifically told him to dress however he felt comfortable. The students looked confused. A few whispered to each other. They'd clearly been expecting someone older, more traditional looking. Everyone, Patricia said. This is Daniel Chen. He's been practicing law for 2 years, specializes in tenant rights, and he recently taught me one of the most important lessons of my career. Daniel set his backpack down and pulled out a chair, sitting casually at the table rather than standing at the front of the room. It immediately made the atmosphere feel less formal, more like a conversation. Thanks for having me, Daniel said. Judge Morgan asked me to talk about my experience as a young attorney. So I'll start with a story from a few weeks ago. He told them everything, walking into the courtroom in his hoodie, the judge's assumptions and insults, the moment he revealed his bar card, the case itself. The students listened, completely absorbed. One student, a woman named Rebecca, raised her hand. "How did you stay so calm?" "I would have been furious," Daniel shrugged. "I was angry, but anger doesn't win cases. Evidence does. Besides, I knew something the judge didn't. I knew I was qualified. Her opinion of me couldn't change that fact, but doesn't it hurt?" another student asked. "Being dismissed like that?" "Of course it hurts," Daniel said honestly. "Every time. But here's what I've learned. People's assumptions say more about them than they say about me. The judge assumed I was incompetent because of how I looked. That was her limitation, not mine." Patricia shifted in her seat, feeling the weight of those words again. A male student in an expensive suit spoke up. "But don't you think you could avoid some of that by dressing more professionally?" "Not judging, just asking." Daniel smiled. "That's a fair question. And yes, I could. But should I have to? Should my grandmother's case have depended on whether I wore the right clothes that morning? What about clients who can't afford nice suits? Should they lose their cases because of appearances?" The student nodded slowly, considering this. "Plus," Daniel continued, "I want people to underestimate me. When lawyers like Hayes see me and think I'm just some kid, they don't prepare properly. They get overconfident. And that's when I beat them." The students laughed. Patricia spoke up. "Daniel, tell them about why you chose this kind of law." "You could work anywhere." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "When I was in law school, firms were recruiting hard. Big salaries, prestigious cases, corner offices. And I was tempted, I won't lie. That kind of money would have changed my life." He paused, looking around the room. "But then I thought about my grandmother, about the people in her building, about every person I'd ever known who got crushed by a system they didn't understand. And I realized something. Those big firms, they don't need me. They have hundreds of talented lawyers. But the people in my neighborhood, they need someone desperately." "Don't you struggle financially?" Rebecca asked. "I'm drowning in student loans." "I do struggle," Daniel admitted. "I share an office with 2 other lawyers to split rent. I drive a car that's held together with hope and duct tape. Some months are tight, but I sleep well at night. I know the work I'm doing matters." Another student raised her hand. "What about burnout? Don't you get exhausted fighting all the time?" "Absolutely," Daniel said. "There are days I want to quit. Days when I lose cases I should have won. Days when clients can't pay me anything, and I have to take the case anyway because no one else will. Days when judges make decisions based on prejudice instead of law." He glanced at Patricia, who nodded for him to continue. "But then I think about my grandmother's face when I told her we won. When I told her she didn't have to worry about that landlord anymore. When I told her we got enough money for her to move somewhere safe and still have savings left over. That look, that's why I do this." The room was silent for a moment. "Here's what I want you all to understand," Daniel said, his voice stronger now. "The legal system is powerful. It can destroy people or protect them, and you're about to become part of that system. You get to choose what kind of lawyer you'll be." He stood up and walked slowly around the table as he spoke. "You can be the kind of lawyer who judges people by their bank accounts, who only takes cases that pay well, who sees clients as billable hours. There's nothing illegal about that. You'll probably make a lot of money." He paused. "Or you can be the kind of lawyer who remembers that behind every case is a real person, someone's grandmother, someone's child, someone who's scared and doesn't understand what's happening, someone who needs help." Patricia watched the students' faces. They were hanging on every word. "You don't have to be poor to be a good lawyer," Daniel continued. "You don't have to suffer to help people. But you do have to care. You have to remember that justice isn't just an abstract concept. It's real. It affects real lives." He sat back down. "Judge Morgan insulted me in that courtroom. She made assumptions. She was wrong. But you know what impressed me? She apologized. She listened. She learned. That's rare. Most people double down when they're wrong." Patricia felt tears threatening but held them back. "That's my advice to all of you," Daniel said. "Stay humble, stay open. Admit when you're wrong, and never ever forget why you wanted to be a lawyer in the first place." After the session ended and the students filed out, several stopped to shake Daniel's hand and exchange contact information. Patricia watched as a few students pulled him aside to ask about working in tenant rights law. When everyone had left, Daniel grabbed his backpack. That was perfect, Patricia said. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, Daniel replied. And for being willing to change. I heard something interesting yesterday, Patricia said. 3 judges in this courthouse have reached out to me asking about implicit bias training. Word spreads fast, Daniel smiled. That's good. Really good. Your grandmother, Patricia asked. How is she? She's great. Moved into a new apartment last week. 1 bedroom, but it's clean and safe. She actually has a view of a park. She sits by the window every morning with her tea. I'm glad, Patricia said. And I hope you know that what happened in my courtroom that day changed me. I'm a better judge because of you. Daniel adjusted his backpack. Then my grandmother's case did more than just help her. That's pretty cool. As he walked toward the door, Patricia called out one more time. Daniel, keep fighting. The system needs more people like you. He turned back and grinned. The system needs more judges like you too, ones who are willing to learn. And with that, he walked out of the courthouse, just another young person in a hoodie and sneakers. But Patricia knew better now. She knew that heroes come in all kinds of packages. And sometimes the person you underestimate is exactly the person who will teach you the most important lesson of your life. She returned to her courtroom with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to treat every person who walked through that door with the dignity and respect they deserved, regardless of how they looked or where they came from. Because that was justice. Real justice. The kind Daniel fought for every single day.